Shakespeare lived in Stratford-on-Avon in England in the 1500s. This is a death mask that was actually made of his face after he died. People used to enjoy having these kind of things around the house if they were wealthy enough in order to remember famous people or ancestors. Queen Elizabeth, who was born in 1558, 6 years before Shakespeare, was the ruling queen at the time. We've all heard of Henry VIII, her father, who killed or banished wife after wife. But Elizabeth was a completely different type of temperament. She brought peace internationally and nationally. And for the first time in forever, the English had the leisure to think of art and philosophy, not just survival. In 1588, she had defeated the Spanish Armada, but I actually think that was primarily due to luck and really bad weather, a storm that drove the Armada away and sank many of them. But the threat of Spanish world domination was quelled. In the 1500s, the population in England quadrupled and a middle class was born. This was Shakespeare's era. Food and services had to be provided to many people. People were predominantly white. I'm just showing you some landscape background pictures. These are modern pictures, but they're kind of historically accurate. Today, the population of the people in England from countries other than Europe is under or around 7%. England is still mostly white. We can imagine that 450 years ago it was much, much less integrated even than it is now, though I can't find any demographics on that. This is a typical piece of architecture for the day. This is the way buildings looked. It's generally been believed that most Englanders had never seen a black person, but that may be wrong in the light of more recent scholarship. But more about that a little. This is a typical costume of wealthy people. Notice that men wore tights. And a married woman kept her head covered. So during this period of time, it was considered to be an era of exploration and art. Elizabeth was very into everything her father had not been into. She sent Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Scott Raleigh around the world to sail the globe, and regular people began to imagine a much greater scope of possibility of ways that different people lived, and things from around the world began to be, and people unfortunately began to be imported. So Sir Walter Raleigh, he explored the new continent, that's us, or the new world of South America, bringing back gold and tobacco. This is not a particularly glorious era to be proud of, but they certainly felt glorious. Look at that ruffle he's wearing around his neck and the big earring he's got on. A very fancy person. The economic, political, and religious conflicts had been for a time still conflicts from her father's era and before. And that period of rest allowed for the flourishing of philosophy and artistic creativity. It was called the Renaissance or Renaissance. Elizabeth was very fond of theater, and she endowed it. The profession of all aspects of playwriting and production became legitimized with her stamp of approval and funding. Many essayists, poets, and playwrights that flourished under her blessing are still read today. And this semester we did not read any Marlowe, Johnson, or Spencer, but at some point in your education you may encounter any number of people who were contemporaries of Shakespeare, who became artists that went down in history. Here's Sir Francis Drake. We have our Sir Francis Drake Boulevard. 1586, he burned and raided St. Augustine, a Spanish settlement in Florida. And Edmund Spenser, who wrote a very famous long poem called The Fairy Queen, was a fantasy featuring Queen Gloriana, who represented Queen Elizabeth. Here's Ben Jonson, the poet, in the middle. Christopher Marlowe, a poet and playwright, who's on the right. Some of you might have read a Marlowe poem this semester. I'm not really sure. I don't remember offhand. So, during this period of time, Elizabeth mandated an official religion, which was the Church of England. Today in the United States, we usually call it Episcopal or Anglican. Catholics who had their own quiet and out of the public eye, no church structures, they couldn't meet in church structures, but if they had private services, Elizabeth wouldn't harass them. Remember that her father, Henry VIII, had declared himself the head of the church because the Pope would not allow him to continue getting annulments. He wanted a divorce because he was desperately in search of a male heir. So that's why the English church broke away from the Catholic Church. That's the beginnings of our Episcopal Church. It wasn't illegal to be a Catholic, but they weren't allowed to be public about it. She was tolerant. During her father and after his death, there were bloody Catholic-Protestant wars. To keep peace in the country, she didn't allow Catholics to worship openly, but she didn't persecute them if they kind of stayed to themselves. So education. Boys started school at age 6 for 11 hours a day. They learned Latin. By 1600, about a third of the males could read in England. Girls were not schooled because it's a waste of time. What kind of education does a housewife need? Girls of wealth would learn to read and write and manage an estate and a staff, and they learned artistic things like dance and playing an instrument or singing if they had a voice. Refuse and sewage were thrown right out into the street from windows and doors. Most people quite poor. So it was a very unsanitary time to live. People had to smell that and walk through it along with horse manure. And people frequently worked outdoors because they didn't have electricity inside, of course. And candles, wax candles were quite expensive, and so was oil. So during the daytime, you would see people working outdoors. But because of the unsanitary conditions, people died younger than they do today. 200 years earlier, the bubonic plague wiped out about a third of the population. But people didn't understand bacteria and germs yet. They didn't understand fleas and how the plague was transmitted from rats to humans. So, some of the themes that Shakespeare wrote about, he was concerned very much with how do we know things. By the way, this is Shakespearean era music in the background. If you don't like it, I apologize. I hope a commercial won't butt in really loudly from YouTube. Shakespeare was concerned with things like how do we know things? Can we trust our senses? What is actually true or good or beautiful? What is the self? How do we apprehend ourselves? How do we know ourselves? How do we know others? Do the events of life have any meaning in any order? Shakespeare challenges beliefs held by many people that God causes all events. So he was kind of radical for his time. Othello does look at race and sexuality, power and greed, betrayal, suspicion, and many other very relevant topics that probably will never go away in human nature. As you read Othello, see what big ideas you can come across. Here's his soliloquy about suicide from Hamlet. Most people have heard this or heard of it. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take up arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them to die. to sleep no more, and by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to. Oh, 'tis a consumption devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub, for in that sleep of death, what dreams may come. When we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. Every class of, let me back up. I think I got something out of order here. And I'm not sure what I did here. I think this slide is out of order, but now anyway. So people might wonder, didn't Shakespeare know any slang? Did everything he write about, was it all lofty and put in big fancy words? No, he knew a lot of slang. And in Othello, he's got a number of images for sex. In just Act 1, Scene 1, he's got an old black ram tupping your white ewe. Tupping is an old-fashioned agrarian term for mating with or mounting. A ewe is a female sheep. A ram is a male sheep. You'll have your daughter covered with a Barbary horse. Covering is the breeding term when a male mounts a female horse. That's still a breeder term used today. And then he refers to the beast with two backs, and it doesn't take any imagination to wonder what that means. Okay, who saw his plays? Every class of person, even in women and children. Poor people who stood on the ground and were called groundlings, paid a whole day's wage, which was a pence or a penny, to get to stand in front of the stage, like these people. No folding benches or chairs for them, but rich people got to sit in various areas with benches. Price. This is what the Globe Theater, open-top theater, looked like. This is the theater that Queen Elizabeth built for Shakespeare, and there you can see in the box seats are the people who had the money to pay for them. Seating in the covered galleries, so you were out of the rain and the wind, or the snow perhaps. It could be as much as half of a crown, or a poor person's wage for 2 months. For you and me, that's like working at McDonald's about 12 hours a day for 2 months just to go see The Revenant or whatever is popular right now. But lots and lots of people did it. Every class and type of person went to plays. This is the first public entertainment that was allowed. Under King Henry, this was illegal. Plays and public arts were legal except for troubadours who sang songs. They were basically the traveling newspapers. Tradesmen that went included tanners, which was an extremely smelly job. That's when you're tanning hides of animals. The hides have been taken off the animals, and these people would smell really bad. You can't get the odors out of their clothes, so you might be standing on the ground. You might be a groundling standing next to someone who just really, really reeks. Butchers, who would be smelling of blood and all kinds of things. Smithies, people who made like horseshoes and things out of metal. People who made and sewed fabric. Merchant marines, servants, bakers. Every kind of worker would go, and with their whole family. The audience would shout at the actors. If you've ever heard of Beach Blanket Babylon, which is an audience interactive event, it's kind of like that. The audience would be shouting. They would throw worse. They would heckle. If they didn't like the actor, they'd throw food at them, rotting food. People felt free to eat and to be loud. Garbage was dropped on the floor. Dogs would roam freely. They would eat whatever scraps were dropped and left. Tempers would flare. There would be fights. There would be things thrown at the actors. Men fought to sit by women. People pushed, they shoved. Men hit on women with no subtlety at all. Bands of poor rough men, possibly people with criminal behavior, would attend together, and they could cause trouble or rob people. Shakespeare even wrote lines into his plays that were intended to point out some of those unsavory people. At any rate, though it's not as rough as a mosh pit, the Globe in the 1500s was definitely an audience participatory, earthy, smelly, and loud place. And by the way, the word auditorium comes from the roots audio, which means to hear. So an auditorium is literally a place where you go to hear a play. People didn't say, I'm going to go see a play. They'd say, I'm going to go hear it. So they'd wrap a leg of mutton up and a hunk of cheese and Tom's old shirt, and they'd go tailgate it in the theater. Here is a picture of our Globe Theater in San Francisco, built in. This is our Globe Theater, the same size as, same square footage as Shakespeare's Globe. This is not our Globe Theater. This is the Fillmore. So all of the greatest pop and culture musicians have played here since the 30s, and it's just to give you a size comparison to the Globe. What about race in Othello? There's quite a bit of art from the 1500s showing integrated activities and people of color in Europe. This is a black man and a white man dancing together in public. Men and women were not allowed to dance in public. Men could dance with men at functions that had dance as part of the celebration. And it was not considered a homosexual event. And these races are mingling in this picture. There's nothing strange about it. This is an excerpt from a larger picture where all kinds of people are dancing, and this apparently was considered to be completely normal, the interracial dancing and contact. So there are a lot of repeated stereotypical references to the features of black people in Othello, and just a trigger alert, it seems offensive to us today. While there were people of many races in England, Africans were not generally settlers there. That's partly because England raided African colonies with regularity, and so they certainly did not have a good reputation among Africans. And in the mid-1500s, they kidnapped Africans and brought them first to England, not as actual slaves as we knew it or we came to know it through history, but it was the forerunner of the slave trade. Scholars traditionally believe the Englanders had never seen Africans during Shakespeare's time, but there's a scholar named Habib who says there were Africans in even African-American neighborhoods in England. The way they originally got there was that, quote, they existed initially as a miscellaneous assemblage of exotic, personally possessed, decorative fetishes and human curiosities. In other words, they were items for exhibit, for entertainment, for people to look at. So if you were a very rich person and you had a party, you might display a person of a different ethnicity as kind of a guest of honor. That would be the intrigue of the evening. But these kind of fetishes were not, continuing with the quote, they were not totally culturally unrecorded. There was some record of them, but little record, and so this mostly was a silent and invisible community. So Shakespeare also probably had at least one intense relationship with a black prostitute, according to the scholar Habib, but he didn't marry her due to social conventions. Habib feels this influenced his exploration of racial themes in many of his works, including Othello. I'm going to read a sonnet to you, and I cannot get out of this slideshow to turn the volume down on the background music, so I hope you'll be able to hear this. This is Sonnet 127. In the old age, black was not counted fair, or if it were, it bore not beauty's name. But now, black is beauty's successive heir, and beauty slandered with a bastard shame, for since each hand hath put on nature's power, fairing the foul with art's false borrowed face, sweet beauty hath no name, no holy bower. but is profaned if not lives in disgrace. Therefore my mistress' eyes are raven black, her eyes so suited, and they mourners seem as such who, not born fair, no beauty lack, slandering creation with a false esteem. Yet so they mourn, becoming of their woe, that every tongue shall say, beauty should look so. Now, without this in front of you, and with just trying to listen, and without studying and breaking down this sonnet, you probably didn't follow that, so I have it for English here. This is what Shakespeare would have written in modern language. In the olden days, dark complexions weren't considered attractive, or if they were, no one called them beautiful. But now, darkness is officially accepted as beautiful, and the fair complexions that used to be called beautiful have gotten a bad reputation. For since everyone has seized the power to make themselves beautiful, which used to belong to nature, and ugly people can be beautiful by artificial means, no one can legitimately be called beautiful. Beauty has no special home, but is commonplace or even lives in disgrace. Therefore, my mistress' eyes are black as a raven, well suited to today's fashion, and in their blackness they seem to be lamenting those people who were born ugly, but make themselves beautiful, giving beauty a bad name by faking it. But her black eyes lament so beautifully that everyone now says all beautiful eyes should look like hers. So, during Shakespeare's time, though, many people had not seen Africans. 6 Arabians came to Queen Elizabeth under the pretext of making trade negotiations, but actually they came to secretly seek an alliance against the Spanish. People around London may have seen those foreigners, who might have been looked on as something like rock stars in that they were exotic and rich. The appetite for the novel, what today might be called pop culture, could have also thrust race onto the stage in Shakespeare's plays. You're going to see the word Moor used in the play. Now, we typically treat Moor as if it means a black person, and it could be, but it could have also at this time referred to a Muslim or even a Jew. For centuries before Shakespeare's time, Africans had been held in honor by many Europeans in European countries. They could hold positions of great importance in most countries. Often, kidnapped Africans who lived in Europe would actually be raised in families who were wealthy, they would be educated, and could rise to great social position and power. I found evidence that all through Europe, except in the British Isles, Africans were completely economically and socially integrated into society. Not many Africans I could see, but some. Here's a nobleman from Austria around 1520, Shakespeare's time. This is Alessandro de Medici, Duke of Florence, mid-1500s. Florence was a happening place, a center of art. This is obviously by his dress, a wealthy person, and he's holding his head up straight. This is a person with no shame. So, this is a painting from a scene in Portugal around 1560, totally integrated community. Here's Hans Dürer, a famous artist. Here's a nobleman in Vienna from 1508. So it's not true that there were no African people with education, status, integration, education. Discrimination was not what we understand it to be with our American history. They did not have our hideous history of race relations, persecution of anybody of any kind of color. So it was much easier, even though there were not many communities of African people, and they were a definite minority. It was easier for people if they had an opportunity to become people of status and totally, belong to the culture. So, Othello is an African Moor. We assume, well, he's cast as African, but really, technically, Moor could have been also Muslim or Jew. Anyone outside of being a white Protestant or a white Catholic. He is a general of the Venetian army, and here we are in Italy. You can see Italy. You can see Venice up there. I don't know if you can see my cursor in this slideshow. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. We'll get another close-up of that in a minute. He's going to be transferred to the island of Cyprus in the Mediterranean Sea. His status, income, and power, as we've just seen from those other pictures, it was not impossible. So the setting is going to move to Cyprus, which was a military and trade. There's back to Venice up there. They're the ones defending Cyprus. So this is kind of a picture of what Cyprus looks like from the air. This is not the whole of Cyprus, of course. So Venice in Italy had a population of about 170,000 people. That's about the same population of Roseville outside of Sacramento. Venice has openly been called the fish that was Venice, and you can see in this picture, it almost looks like the fish fins are on the right and the head is on the left, but there's quite a few smaller islets around here. It's all waterways as well. It doesn't have highways and concrete structures for roads the same way that we do. Houses open right onto the water. And people didn't have cars, they had boats. So paintings and architecture, international trade, music, and all things Venetian were coveted all over Europe. You want silk from China? Get it through Venice, through Cyprus, really. But you import it through the trade center in Venice. So for Desdemona, who Othello is going to marry, a senator's daughter, to have an exotic Moor ahead of the military might of Cyprus was kind of like getting to elope with, Prince Harry or Beckham or Haley or Tupac or David Bowie or Jerry Rice or, somebody who was a rock star. She would have been expected to marry as she was told, but she took things into her own hands with the biggest star that she knew of in her very protected world, protected and governed over by her father. So the play opens like many movies do. You're just plopped right in the middle of a scene and dialogue is happening. It doesn't open with the narrator telling you all about the context and the setting and everything like that. You just jump in. And then you have to assume there's a backstory. So what goes on when our play starts is there's a conversation between Othello's main man and trusted aide, his ensign. His name is Iago. And Roderigo, a rich man who has been trying to woo Desdemona himself. Iago's been helping Roderigo. Iago declares his hatred for Othello because another man received the promotion for lieutenant that Iago wanted. So Iago's helping Roderigo get Desdemona because he doesn't want Othello to have anything good. He's already starting out with revenge, but we have to figure that out as we go. We learn that early in Act 1. He's jealous and full of hatred, already by Act 1, Scene 1, and this is where Shakespeare chooses to locate us as we enter Othello's world. We enter it through Iago. And Iago's discussion with Roderigo is kind of important. So, here we are back in the picture of where Cyprus is in Act 2. Desdemona and Othello are going to go to Cyprus, where Othello has been commissioned. Cyprus during that time during the time Shakespeare was writing, was colonized by Venice, as I went over. And the Venetians used to actually pirate ships in the Mediterranean, particularly Turkish ships. So the Venetians were the sea pirates, as well as being the military might. So Venetians would kill everybody on trade ships aboard and take the ship over. Here's a picture of modern-day Cyprus. It's the playground of the rich and famous for holidays. I think it's exquisite, and I would love to go there, but it would cost me everything I ever have owned. It's another picture. It's a beautiful place. So the Venetians were very oppressive to the local people. Any culture, it seems like, when they start getting economic dominance, they exploit others, and Venice was no different. They set up domination in Cyprus and anywhere they could. This oppression may not have been known about in London, but it may have been. We don't know. But this is where Othello's post was, in a place of political and economic intrigue, and a place of struggle for economic and military domination. Othello is not a laid-back person. He's about conquest. He's about power. He's a career military. The goings-on of world politics were hot gossip, and plays and troubadours, the singing news carriers, were all about what's going on in the regions around us and the world. So Shakespeare cashed in on people's curiosity about the rich and the famous, and about what's going on here in this economic political hub of the world. We begin the play. On the left is Lawrence Fishburne as Othello and Kenneth Branagh as Iago. I like this picture a lot because of the staging and the posture. It gives us a lot of character clues. Othello is facing straight forward. He's a straight-on kind of person, very methodical. He takes and follows directions. But that countenance on his face is not the countenance of the confident, happy person we meet him as at the beginning of the play. Iago there, who is very close to him, with his chin tipped up, we can kind of maybe infer he is just speaking right into Othello's ear. And Iago is not looking up. His eyes are not open to the world. There's kind of an intimate secrecy about Iago's stance toward Othello, and whatever he's telling him is not sitting well in Othello. So here's our introduction to the play. I do not have access at this point to a free copy of the play for us to view, but I hope to have that up within a few days so that you can watch this production. I believe it's 1994. Branagh directed it, and it's very accurate to the text. There are many, many modern versions of Shakespeare. I encourage you to Google some, watch them. There's some really interesting modern adaptations, so they may help you understand the play if you'd like. All right, that's the end.